Our next question is about the presidency. Listen.
Who would you say are the three greatest American presidents and why? And if there are no Democrats in this group, who is the best Democratic president?
Okay, good one. Let me start with the three greatest presidents. The greatest one, in my opinion, Abraham Lincoln. Now, I know there are a lot of people who would put Washington in that category. And I think that Washington, obviously, the father of the country, deserves enormous credit. I would put Washington probably in the second place. But Lincoln, for his philosophical statesmanship, for, in a sense, realizing the promise that was implicit in the founding, but could not be realized in the founding era itself, which is the deep idea of equal rights under the law, equal dignity, all men are created equal. The founders thought of that. Jefferson articulated it, but Lincoln implemented it, and implemented it under extremely challenging conditions. So I'm a huge fan of Lincoln. I, by the way, do not agree with the view that Lincoln became some sort of a dictator or that Lincoln plunged the nation precipitously into a war that could have been avoided. No, it was the Southern Democrats who provoked the war. They started it. And their beef was what? They didn't like the results of an election. And because they didn't agree, they agreed that Lincoln had been freely elected, but they didn't like the outcome of it. And so they decided, let's pack up our bags and essentially break the country into two. So Lincoln, number one, Washington, number two, and I would say Reagan, number three. Now, some people go, what about Teddy Roosevelt? And what about Trump? Well, with Trump, I'm not going to count him in the mix, partly because I think that Trump's, let's just say his engagement with America is incomplete. Here's a guy, I think, who is likely to run again. And if he runs again, then we will have to look at the Trump story in its full context. It's easier to be able to look back at history, to look at presidents who have served their one term or their two terms. And so I'm limiting myself to presidents who are in that category. Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, deserves to be considered. I have a higher view of him than I used to. I used to think of Teddy Roosevelt as this kind of unfortunate Republican progressive, somebody who had, well, some rather questionable views about social Darwinism, who seemed to have an anti-capitalist streak. He denounced big corporations. He fashioned himself as a kind of grand slayer of these corporations. But I think, again, looking back and reconsidering my earlier view, I now see Teddy Roosevelt as having exposed cartels and monopolies. And we're living in an age of cartels and monopolies. And our monopolies are worse than the monopolies that Teddy Roosevelt confronted. Why? Because our monopolies are shutting down our basic civil liberties. It's one thing to have a telecommunications monopoly that, let's say, for example, controls the telegraph, but isn't censoring the content of the telegraph, or you have a single phone company, but it isn't censoring what is said on the phone. That's completely different from some of our monopolies like Google, which use their power to shut down or censor you, or to propagandize you. And so Teddy Roosevelt's old antagonism toward monopolies, I think, is something that's more admirable to me now than I might have thought before. Let me turn to the Democrats. You might expect me to say that the best Democrat is Thomas Jefferson, but no, Thomas Jefferson was not a Democrat. His party was called the Democratic Republican Party. Later, it split into the Democratic Party and then the Whigs. So Jefferson is sometimes claimed by leftists, well, he was the first Democratic. No, he wasn't. The first Democratic president was Andrew Jackson. Now, Trump apparently has a liking for Andrew Jackson. I don't know who talked him into that, probably Bannon. But Jackson is not a good Democratic president. Jackson was a very bad guy. If you read a book called Jackson Land, you'll see why he was a complete crook. Now, he was a patriot, and he did fight for the country. There's aspects of Jackson I do admire. But overall, this was a guy who did terrible crimes against the blacks and against the Indians, and was also thoroughly corrupt to boot, setting up, if you will, the corruption later of Hillary Clinton and now of Joe Biden. The best Democratic president, in my view, is someone you may not even have heard of. It's Polk. It's James Polk, who was in the middle of the 19th century. And I admire him for a single reason. Yeah, he was a slave owner, and that was bad. But what Polk did was he won the Mexican War that took place between 1845, I believe, and 1848, a 3-year war. He then brought large parts of California and also large parts of Canada into the United States. So the United States in territory doubled in size. Unbelievable. And all of this happened within a single term. James Polk served only one term. So this unheralded, in some cases unknown Democratic president is my candidate for not one of the best American presidents, but in very low company, the best of the Democrats.